When the carriage stopped at the gates of Thornfield Abbey for the second time in my life, I was wearing sable. The first time, I had been wearing a brown stuff gown with the cuffs turned twice because they were too long, and a bonnet that had been my mother's, and shoes that had been mended with tallow. I had been 17 years old. I had walked the last mile from the village because the carrier had only taken me as far as the crossroads, and I had stood in the rain at this same gate for a quarter of an hour before the lodge-keeper had decided I was harmless enough to admit. He had not recognized me as anyone's anything. He had been correct. The second time, I was 24. I was wearing sable, and the lodge-keeper opened both gates without a word, and bowed so low I could see the thin patch on the crown of his head. "Welcome home, your grace," he said. I did not correct him. I had not been a grace for 13 months, since my husband's funeral, and a widow does not lose the title. She carries it like a coin she has already spent. But I let him say it, because I had not come back to Thornfield to argue with the servants. I had come back to take the house. The carriage rolled up the long avenue of limes. The trees had been planted by the third Duke in 1782, the year his daughter had eloped with a music master, and he had decided to look at something other than the gravel sweep when he walked out of his front door. I knew that because I had dusted the third Duke's diary in the muniment room every Tuesday for 14 months when I was a housemaid in this house, and I had read every page of it because no one had ever told me I was not allowed to. No one had ever told me anything I was not allowed to do in those months. They had simply assumed I would understand it on my own. I had understood most of it. The rest I had learned the hard way. The avenue ended in the wide, gravelled forecourt, and the great south front of the abbey rose up before me, 3 stories of pale Cotswold stone with the long line of tall sash windows that had been put in by the 4th Duke in 1801, and the carved Ashworth arms above the door, and the 2 stone lions on either side of the steps that had each been missing a paw since I was a child. The right-hand lion was missing his left paw. The left-hand lion was missing his right. They faced each other across the steps like 2 old soldiers, neither of whom would be the first to lower his sword. The carriage stopped. The footman jumped down to put the steps. I waited. I had learned, in the year since my husband's death, that a woman who alighted from a carriage 1 beat too quickly was a woman who had not yet understood her own consequence. The front door of Thornfield Abbey opened. The man who came out onto the top step was not the man I had expected, and the small, steady fire that I had been carrying in my chest for 13 months gave one great surge and steadied again. The current Duke of Ashworth, Frederick, the cousin who had inherited the title when my husband died because we had had no son, the cousin I had met precisely twice, the cousin whose letters to me since the funeral had grown each month colder and more peremptory, was in residence. I had hoped he would not be. I had timed my arrival for a week, he had told me, in his last letter, he intended to spend at Newmarket. He had lied. Or he had returned. Either way, the matter would be settled today rather than in a fortnight, and I found that I did not mind. He stood on the top step in a green riding coat and high boots, and he looked down at the carriage with the expression of a man who had been told a parcel was being delivered and had come outside to examine it for damage. "Caroline," he said, before I had even risen from my seat. "What an extraordinary surprise. I had no notion you intended to call." "I did not call, Frederick," I said. "I came home." I gave the footman my hand and stepped down. The sable cloak fell about me as it had been cut to fall, and the small black hat with the single white feather sat on my dark hair, as my milliner in Bond Street had promised me it would. And I walked across the gravel to the foot of the steps and stopped. And I looked up at Frederick Ashworth, the 5th Duke of Ashworth, and I let him take in what he was looking at. He was a tall man, sandy-haired, with a long jaw and pale eyes set close together. He had the Ashworth nose. He did not have the Ashworth eyes. Those had gone with my husband into the family vault. And he did not have the Ashworth bearing, though he had been working at it for 13 months and was almost there. He was 33. He had been a barrister with a comfortable practice and a small house in Bloomsbury, and a wife who had, I had heard, taken to the title with rather more appetite than her husband. And now he was the Duke of Ashworth, and he stood on the steps of Thornfield Abbey as if he had been born to them, and he had not. "I beg your pardon," he said. The smile he gave me did not reach his eyes. "I confess I do not entirely follow." "Then let us go inside," I said, "and I shall explain it to you. I have travelled since dawn, and I should very much like a cup of tea." I went up the steps past him without waiting for his answer. Behind me, I heard him hesitate. I heard the small, sharp breath he took before he turned to follow. I heard, faintly, the low murmur of one of the footmen in the hall, a man named Coombs, who had been a young footman when I was a housemaid here, and who, I knew without looking, had recognized me the moment I stepped down from the carriage, and who had been waiting 7 years to see what I had just done. I crossed the threshold of Thornfield Abbey, and I came home. I will tell you how it began. I was the daughter of a country curate in Somerset, and my father had married above himself for love, and had spent the rest of his life apologizing for it. My mother had been the youngest daughter of a baronet, the kind of family that had a name and no money, and she had loved my father very much, and had died of a fever the winter I was 11. My father had kept his living and his small grey vicarage and the 4 bookshelves of theology that had been his only inheritance, and he had raised me himself with the help of an elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Pell, and he had taught me Latin and Greek and a little Hebrew, and how to read a sermon properly, and how to balance a small household on £90 a year, and he had died when I was 16 and left me with nothing. Nothing is a strong word, and I will use it accurately. My father had no estate. The vicarage went with the living. My mother's family had cut her off when she married him, and had not relented in the 17 years since. There was a second cousin in Bristol who wrote to say he was very sorry and that he wished he were in a position to assist, but, as I would understand, his own circumstances did not at present admit of any further calls upon his purse. I read his letter twice and burned it in the kitchen grate, and went to see the rector, who was to take my father's living, and I asked him whether he had any need of a servant. He had not. But his wife, who was a kinder woman than he was, took the trouble to write to a friend in London who had a sister-in-law in service at Thornfield Abbey, and a fortnight later I was on the carrier's cart with a letter of introduction in my pocket and 17 shillings in my reticule, and the whole of my worldly goods in a single trunk, and I was bound for the great house of the Dukes of Ashworth in Gloucestershire, where I was to present myself to the housekeeper, Mrs. Bream, and offer myself for whatever position she might see fit to give me. I was hired as the 3rd housemaid. I was paid £8 a year and my keep. My duties were to rise at 5:30 in the morning, to clean the grates in the family rooms before the family came down, to dust and sweep and polish in such rooms as Mrs. Bream allotted me, to fetch and carry, to mend my own caps and aprons in the evenings, and to be silent and invisible at all times when any member of the family was present in any room I happened to be working in. I was to address Mrs. Bream as Ma'am, and Mr. Coombs, the under-butler, as Mr. Coombs, and the family as Your Grace, or My Lord, or My Lady, according to their rank, and never, under any circumstances, to speak to them unless I had been spoken to first. I learned the rules in a week. I kept them for 7 months. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd October, I had been in the house. I was carrying a copper jug of hot water up the back stairs to fill the warming pans in the south guest rooms, and I came round the half landing too fast, and I walked directly into the chest of the 4th Duke of Ashworth, who was descending. I did not drop the jug. That is the part I have always been most proud of. I did not drop the jug, and I did not scream, and I did not faint, and I did not curtsy, because curtsying with a copper jug full of boiling water is not a thing a sensible person attempts. I stood absolutely still on the half landing with the jug between us, and water sloshing dangerously near the rim, and I looked at the Duke of Ashworth, and he looked at me. He was 40 years old. His hair was very dark, almost black, and he wore it longer than the fashion. His eyes were the grey-green of weathered slate. He had the long Ashworth nose and the high Ashworth cheekbones, and a mouth that seemed always on the point of saying something dry. He had been the master of Thornfield Abbey for 11 years. He had been a widower for 9. His first wife had died in childbirth, with a son who had not survived her by an hour, and he had, since then, lived a quiet, bachelor life in his great house, with his books and his horses, and his improvements to the home farm, and he had not, by any account I had ever heard from anyone in the servants' hall, shown the slightest sign of looking for a second wife. He looked at me on the half-landing for the space of perhaps 2 seconds. "Forgive me," he said. "Are you scalded?" It was the first thing he had ever said to me. I have remembered the cadence of it ever since. He did not say it as a master speaks to a servant. He said it as a man who has nearly walked into another person on a staircase and is concerned for them. There was no ornament to it. He had spoken in his own voice. "No, Your Grace," I said. "I beg your pardon. I should have stopped at the landing." "It is a corner," he said. "I am familiar with it. Are you certain you were not scalded?" "Quite certain, Your Grace." He stepped back against the wall to let me pass. I went up the stairs with the jug and my heart hammering, and at the top I looked back down because I could not help it. And he was still standing on the half-landing watching me, and when he saw me look back he lifted one eyebrow very slightly, in the manner of a man who has caught a person doing what he had thought they would do. And he turned and went on down. I did not see him for 3 weeks. He went to London. I scrubbed grates and dusted the muniment room, and read the 3rd Duke's diary on Tuesdays, and was a perfectly satisfactory 3rd housemaid. In late November, in a slow, grey afternoon when the rest of the household believed him still in town, the Duke came home unexpectedly and found me in the muniment room. I had just settled down on the floor with my back against the bookshelf and the 3rd Duke's diary open across my knees, in the half-hour between finishing my dusting and the bell that would call us to tea. I had taken off my apron because the apron was wet from the dustcloths. I had loose hair coming down at the temple where my cap was crooked. I was reading a passage in which the 3rd Duke described, in the driest possible Latin, what his daughter's music master had said to him on being shown out of the house. I heard the door open. I looked up. The 4th Duke of Ashworth stood in the doorway in his travelling coat, with his hat still in his hand, and he looked at me on the floor of his muniment room with his great-grandfather's diary across my knees, and a complicated thing happened in his face. There was, first, the sharpness of a man who has caught a servant doing something a servant should not be doing. There was, second, the surprise of a man who has caught a servant doing something he had not imagined a servant capable of. There was, third, a thing I could not read. I scrambled up. The diary fell. I caught it with both hands before it hit the floor. "Your Grace, I beg your pardon. I had finished my work. I should not have. I will return it to the shelf." "What were you reading?" "Your Grace? What passage? What were you reading?" I told him. I told him in the 3rd Duke's Latin, because I was frightened, and because Latin was the language I had learned to be calm in, and I translated it for him as I went, because I did not know whether he had Latin or not, and I did not stop until I had reached the end of the passage where the music master had said something my father would have called untranslatable. The Duke of Ashworth listened. When I had finished, he was silent for a moment. "Where did you learn Latin?" he said. "My father taught me, Your Grace. He was a clergyman." "And he is—" "Dead, Your Grace. 3 years." He nodded, very slowly. "Put the diary back on the shelf," he said. "Your name?" "Caroline Wardley, Your Grace." "How old are you, Miss Wardley?" It was the first time anyone in the house had said "Miss" to me since I had crossed the threshold. 17, Your Grace." He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he gave me a small, almost formal nod, and he went away. I put the diary back on the shelf. I went down to my tea. I did not eat any of it. The next morning, Mrs. Bream sent for me. "His Grace," she said, in the tone of a woman delivering news she did not understand and did not entirely approve of, "has asked that you be moved from housemaid's duties to assist Mr. Probert in the library. You will report to him at 9 in the morning. You will not, Caroline, allow this to give you ideas." I did not allow it to give me ideas. I assisted Mr. Probert, the elderly steward who served as the Duke's librarian, and I dusted books and reshelved books and copied catalogue entries in my schoolgirl's hand. And I learned a great deal more Latin and a little Greek, and the rudiments of how a great library was organized. And I did not, for the next 5 months, exchange a single word with the 4th Duke of Ashworth that was not strictly to do with the location of a particular volume. He came into the library nearly every day. He read in the great chair by the fire. He worked at the long oak table with his estate papers. He did not speak to me unless he needed something, and when he did need something, he asked for it as he would have asked Mr. Probert, with grave courtesy and no familiarity at all. I came to understand, after the first month, that this was deliberate. He was a man who had taken a girl out of the scullery on the strength of a passage of Latin, and he was not going to compound the strangeness of it by treating her as anything other than what she was now. A junior assistant in the library of his great house, being given the chance to be useful. I was very grateful to him. I was also, by Christmas, in love with him. I knew myself well enough to know it. I also knew myself well enough to know that nothing was to be done about it. He was the Duke of Ashworth, and I was a curate's daughter who had been a housemaid 5 months ago and was now an underservant in his library, and the distance between us was not a thing that could be crossed by any honest road. I kept my feelings inside my apron pocket like a folded letter. I did not look at him when he came into the room. I did not let myself. I did not understand, then, that he was doing the same thing. I learned it on a Tuesday afternoon in May, in the rose garden, where I had been sent by Mr. Probert to find a particular variety of damask whose name he had wanted for a passage in a book he was annotating. The Duke was there. He was alone. He had a pair of pruning shears in his hand, and he was pretending, very badly, to use them. He looked up when he saw me. He did not pretend he had not been waiting for me. "Mr. Probert sent you," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. He wished to know the proper name of the dark red damask by the south wall." "Rosa Gallica officinalis," said the Duke. "The apothecary's rose. He knows that. He sent you because I asked him to." I stood quite still in the rose garden, with the smell of the damasks rising around me and the bees moving heavily in the warm afternoon, and I waited. "Miss Wardley," he said. He set down the shears. He did not look at me. He looked at the rose. "I am about to do a thing which, if I do it badly, will make your position in this house impossible. I have been thinking how to do it without doing it badly for 5 months. I have not succeeded. I am therefore going to do it the way I should have done it in November, and I am going to ask you to forgive the months of silence which were my attempt to do better, and which have done worse." I could not speak. "I am in love with you," said the 4th Duke of Ashworth, looking at the apothecary's rose. "I should like to marry you. I am aware of every reason you have to refuse. I am aware that I am 23 years your senior, that I am your employer, that I have not given you any opportunity since November to see me as anything other than a man you owe a debt to, that the world will say I have taken advantage of a girl in my power, and that you have every right, in particular, to be angry with me for having allowed myself to fall in love with a young woman who had no means of refusing me without putting herself out of doors. I will not put you out of doors regardless of your answer. Mr. Probert has been instructed that whatever you say to me in the next 10 minutes, your position in the library is yours for as long as you wish to hold it, and your wages will be doubled, which they should have been 3 months ago. I have written this down and given it to him in writing this morning, so that you may know it is not contingent upon anything else I am about to say." He paused. "That is the floor," he said. "I would now like to speak to you about the rest of the room. May I?" I will tell you what I said. I said yes. Not to the marriage, that came later, after a week of long walks in the park with Mr. Probert at a respectful distance, after a meeting with the Dowager Lady Ashworth, the Duke's mother, who was a small, terrifying woman who had asked me 3 questions and then declared the matter sufficiently considered. After a letter from my second cousin in Bristol, who had heard the rumour and who wrote to congratulate me with a warmth I had not expected, and which I did not, in the event, have reason to trust. The yes to the marriage came in the Rose Garden a week later. The yes in the Rose Garden on the first Tuesday in May was to the rest of the room. I said, "Your Grace, I have loved you since November. I did not allow myself to know it until February. I have not spoken because I did not believe I had any right to be heard. If you are truly asking me, I am truly answering. Yes." He looked at me then. His face had gone very still in the way I would come to know meant he was trying not to show what he felt. He took one step toward me across the rose garden, and he stopped, because Mr. Probert was, by his own arrangement, watching us from the gate. "Then I shall come and call upon you tomorrow," he said, with the smallest possible smile, "in your master's library." We were married in August. The wedding was quiet. The Dowager Lady Ashworth attended, and the Duke's cousin Frederick from London, who had come because he had been invited and had stayed because he had hoped, I think, to find some impediment, and Mr. Probert and Mrs. Bream, the housekeeper, who had cried into her best handkerchief and afterwards told me that I was not, on any account, to forget where I had begun, as if I were ever likely to. My second cousin from Bristol came too, and made a speech in the breakfast-room afterwards in which he said that he had always had the highest opinion of his late cousin Wardley's daughter, which was not true, and that he had always known she would do well, which was also not true, and which I let pass because I had begun to understand, in the months since the engagement, that there is a particular silence a duchess can keep that does more work than any sentence she might say. We were happy. I want to say this clearly, because I do not believe a great deal in the marriages people describe afterwards as having been happy, and I want to be honest about it. We were happy. My husband was a man of grave reserve, who had taught himself, over 20 years of widowerhood, not to expect very much from his life, and he was astonished by happiness when it arrived, and he held it carefully, like a thing he did not entirely trust to be solid. I was a young woman who had been raised on Latin and £90 a year, and I learned how to be the mistress of a great house, and I learned it well. And I learned it because my husband told me from the first day that he had no use for a duchess who pretended to have always been one, and that he had married me because of who I had been on the floor of his muniment room, and that I was on no account to lose her. I did not lose her. We had 5 years and 3 months. We had no children. The first year I miscarried twice, and after that I did not conceive. And in the 3rd year my husband took my hand one evening in the drawing-room and told me that he had not married me for an heir, that he had cousins enough and to spare, and that I was not, on any account, to allow the absence of a child to make me unhappy in his house. I cried. He held me. We did not speak of it again, because there was no need to speak of it again. He died in March of the year I was 23. He had taken a chill in February, riding home from a tenant's farm in the rain, and the chill had become a fever, and the fever had become something I had no name for. And he had died on a Sunday morning, with my hand in his, and the rooks calling from the elms, and the spring not yet come. He had said, the night before, that he had been a fortunate man, and that he was sorry only that he had not had me longer, and that I was to remember I had been loved properly, and to be loved properly was a thing not every life contained. And I was not to spend my widowhood mourning that he had not been able to give me more of it. I held his hand until it had been cold for an hour. Then I rose, and I rang the bell, and I gave the orders for the laying out, and I wrote the letters to the family, and I sat down in the chair in his dressing room where he had used to sit to put on his boots, and I did not weep until the sun was up. His cousin, Frederick, became the 5th Duke of Ashworth before noon. I did not understand, at first, what Frederick intended to do. I had met him twice before the funeral, both times briefly. He had struck me, on each occasion, as a man who did not like me, but I had not minded, because his liking had not been a thing I had any need of. I was the Duchess of Ashworth. My husband was alive. Frederick was a London barrister with a small practice and a sharp wife. The matter of his opinion of me had been about as relevant to my life as the price of fish in Aberdeen. The funeral changed it. I was the widow, and the widow has a settled jointure under the marriage articles, and I had been provided for handsomely by my husband, who had loved me and who had been a careful man. I had a jointure of £1,200 a year, a London house in Berkeley Square that had been settled on me at our marriage, and the right to occupy the dower house at Thornfield for my lifetime. I was 24 years old, and I was a widow, and I was not, by any accounting, a woman in any need of Frederick's protection. What I had not understood, and what I came to understand in the weeks following the funeral, was that the dower house at Thornfield had not, in fact, been formally assigned to me at the marriage. My husband had intended to do it. He had spoken of it. He had not got round to it. The marriage settlement assigned me my jointure and the London house. The dower house remained part of the estate. It was within Frederick's power, as the new Duke, to grant me its tenancy or to withhold it. He withheld it. He did it carefully. His first letter, 3 weeks after the funeral, was full of cousinly concern. He understood I would wish to remove from Thornfield, where every room must hold painful memories. He had instructed his agent to prepare the dower house for my reception at my convenience. His second letter, 3 weeks after that, regretted that on inspection the dower house was found to require certain repairs, which his agent estimated would take some months. His third letter, 2 months after the second, regretted further that the cost of the repairs had proved greater than anticipated, and that, in light of certain calls upon the Ashworth estate which he was not at liberty to particularize, the works had been deferred. His fourth letter suggested that I might find Berkeley Square more congenial in any event than the country in winter, and that perhaps a permanent removal to London would be the most sensible arrangement. His fifth letter, 6 months after the funeral, informed me that he would be taking up residence at Thornfield Abbey himself, with his wife and family, at the conclusion of the official mourning period, and that he trusted I would have removed myself from the main house by that date, which he proposed should be the 1st of September. I removed myself from the main house on the 31st of August. I went to Berkeley Square because the dower house was, of course, not yet ready. I expected it to be made ready in October, in November, by Christmas. It was not made ready. Frederick wrote each month with a fresh impediment. The mason had been called away, the agent had taken ill, the chimney required rebuilding, the roof had been found defective. By March, on the 1st anniversary of my husband's death, I had spent a year in Berkeley Square without once being permitted to set foot inside the dower house at Thornfield, and I had begun to understand what Frederick was doing. He was waiting for me to remarry. If I remarried, my jointure ceased. The London house was mine outright, but the dower house, the country anchor, the visible sign that I was still a part of the Ashworth family and therefore still a personage in the county, would have lapsed. Frederick was a man who had married a woman I would later learn to call sharp without irony, and the sharp Frederica was the kind of woman who did not wish to share Gloucestershire with her husband's late cousin's pretty young widow. If Frederick could keep me out of Thornfield until I married again, the problem would solve itself. And if I did not remarry, he could keep me out indefinitely, in the polite way these things are done, with the regrets and the agents and the chimneys, until I gave up and accepted that I was a London widow, that the country was closed to me, that the great house I had been mistress of for 5 years was now Frederica's house, and that I was, the way the world describes a woman like me when it wishes to be cruel, a person from nowhere, who had married above herself and who had been put back in her place by the family with admirable discretion. I might have accepted it. I'm not too proud to say so. I had been accepting a great many things since I was 11 years old, and I was very tired, and the year of widowhood had taught me that grief is its own kind of obedience. I think there was a version of myself in those first months in Berkeley Square who would have written Frederick a polite letter accepting his suggestion of a permanent London residence, and who would have lived out her widowhood in a quiet house with a small staff and a few books and a great deal of solitary walking in the park, and who would have been called, at parties she did not attend, the most charming of the Ashworth widows. What changed it was a letter. It came in February, 11 months after my husband's death, from Mr. Probert. He had retired from the library 3 years before our marriage and had been pensioned by my husband to a small cottage on the home farm, where he had lived ever since and where he kept up, by way of correspondence, a particular interest in the Thornfield archives. He wrote to me, in his careful elderly hand, to express the hope that I was well, to inquire after my health, and to mention, in a paragraph so scrupulously neutral that I read it 3 times before I understood what he was telling me, that he had recently had occasion to look into a particular cabinet in the muniment room concerning the disposition of certain estate properties, and that he had found, in the course of doing so, a document which he believed I might find of interest, and that he had taken the liberty, given the unsettled nature of the times, of making a careful copy in his own hand and depositing the original with his own attorney in Cirencester for safekeeping. He enclosed the copy. The document was my husband's will. Not the will that had been read at the funeral, the will my husband had drawn up 6 weeks before his death, in his own hand, and signed in the presence of Mr. Probert and the rector of Thornfield, and deposited in the cabinet in the muniment room because he had not yet had the opportunity to send it to his solicitor in London. The will my husband had drawn up because, after our 3rd year of marriage, he had begun to think, quietly, without telling me, about what would become of me if he were to die without an heir. The will in which my husband had assigned the dower house at Thornfield to me absolutely, in fee simple, freed of the entail by the exercise of a power of appointment reserved to him in the original settlement of 1782, and never, until that document, exercised. The will which Frederick, who must have known of its existence, Mr. Probert had mentioned it to him at the funeral, in passing, before realizing that the new Duke had no intention of acknowledging it, had quietly removed from the cabinet in the muniment room, and which had not, since the funeral, been seen. Mr. Probert's copy was unsigned, of course. It was a copy. But it was in Mr. Probert's hand, witnessed by Mr. Probert and by the rector, who was still alive and still at Thornfield. The original was now with an attorney in Cirencester, which was a small market town 12 miles from Thornfield Abbey and 100 miles from any London solicitor of Frederick's acquaintance. And the rector of Thornfield, when applied to, was a man who had buried my husband, and who had baptized 3 generations of Ashworths, and who was not, I thought, likely to have forgotten what he had witnessed in the library on a Wednesday afternoon 6 weeks before the master's death. I wrote 3 letters that evening. The first was to Mr. Probert, thanking him. The second was to a solicitor in Lincoln's Inn, whose name I had been given by a friend of my husband's, asking him to call upon me at Berkeley Square at his earliest convenience. The third was to Frederick at Thornfield, informing him that I would be travelling down to the country in the first week of April to take up residence in the dower house, that I had reason to believe its condition was adequate to receive me, and that I trusted he would have made any final arrangements necessary to my reception by the time I arrived. I posted them in the morning. The solicitor came the next afternoon. He was a small, dry, careful man named Mr. Halford, with very pale eyes and a way of listening that gave nothing away. He read Mr. Probert's copy. He read my marriage settlement. He read the original will that had been read at the funeral. He sat for a long time with all 3 documents arranged on the table in front of him, and he did not speak. "Your Grace," he said at last, "may I ask whether you wish me to act upon this matter?" Yes, Mr. Halford, I do. Forgive me. I must put the question more precisely. The course you have suggested in your letter to His Grace the Duke of Ashworth is a course of considerable boldness. To present yourself at Thornfield Abbey, in the country, in advance of any legal determination of the question of the will, is to confront him on his ground. He will not give way easily. The matter may be ugly. May I ask whether you have considered the alternative, which is to apply to the courts in London, in due form, with the witnesses I shall summon and the original will I shall obtain from Cirencester, and to allow the law to take its course, over a period which I should estimate at not less than 9 months, and possibly considerably more. I have considered it, Mr. Halford. I do not wish to wait 9 months. May I ask why? I looked at him across the table. Because in 9 months Frederick will have been the Duke of Ashworth for 2 years, I said. And in 2 years a man becomes the thing he has been pretending to be. I do not wish him to have those 9 months. I wish him to give up the dower house this April, in front of his servants, who were my servants, in the house I was mistress of for 5 years. I wish the matter to be settled in the place where it ought to be settled. The law will follow afterwards if it must. It will follow more quickly when there is already a fact on the ground for it to ratify. Mr. Halford considered this. He did not smile, because he was not the sort of man who smiled. But the corners of his eyes moved very slightly. "Then I shall make the necessary preparations, Your Grace," he said. "I shall travel to Cirencester next week and obtain the original will from Mr. Probert's attorney, and I shall take affidavits from Mr. Probert and from the rector of Thornfield, and I shall meet you at the Dower House on the 1st of April with all of these in my possession. May I suggest that you travel down with a degree of consequence?" "I had intended to, Mr. Halford." "Then I shall not insult you with further suggestion." He bowed. He left. I went to my milliner the next morning, and I bought the sable cloak, which is how I came to be standing in the great hall of Thornfield Abbey at 1:30 in the afternoon of the 1st of April, in sable and small black hat with a single white feather, watching my husband's cousin Frederick attempt to work out whether to address me as Caroline or as Your Grace. He did not, in the event, manage either. "Caroline," he said, again with the smile that did not reach his eyes, "you must allow me to say that this is most extraordinary. We had not, Frederica and I had not, we are not at present prepared to receive, that is, perhaps in the morning room, where we may speak quietly." "The morning room will do excellently," I said. He had not moved. The footman, Coombs, who had taken my cloak, was standing by the door of the hall with the sable across his arm and an expression of such carefully maintained neutrality on his face that I knew he was enjoying himself. The other footman, a younger man whose name I did not know, who had been engaged by Frederick after my removal, was standing by the foot of the great staircase, watching us with the open uncertainty of a servant whose new master has just been outflanked by a woman in mourning and who does not yet know which way the wind is going to blow. "Coombs," I said, without looking at him, "Mr. Halford of Lincoln's Inn will be arriving by chaise within the hour. Be so good as to show him directly to the morning room when he comes." "Yes, Your Grace," said Coombs, with the smallest possible bow. And I saw Frederick's mouth tighten as he registered the form of address and Coombs's choice to use it. We went to the morning room. Frederica was not there. I had expected her to be, and I was not sorry that she was not. Frederick closed the door behind us. He did not offer me a seat. I took the chair by the window, which had been my chair when I had been mistress of this house, and I arranged my black silk skirts about me, and I looked at him. "Caroline," he said, "I do not know what you have been told, or by whom, but I must ask you to consider that this descent upon Thornfield, unannounced, with a London solicitor, this is not the conduct of a widow in mourning. I had thought we had reached an understanding about the arrangements suitable to your situation. The dower house is mine, Frederick." He stopped. "I beg your pardon," he said. The dower house is mine. It was assigned to me absolutely, in fee simple, by my husband, by an instrument executed in his own hand on the 17th of January last year, witnessed by Mr. Probert and the rector of Thornfield, and deposited in the muniment room of this house. I think you know the document I refer to. I think you have seen it. I think you have, in fact, removed it from the place where my husband left it. And I think you have done so because you knew that as long as it remained where it was, I had a claim upon Thornfield, which you were not prepared to acknowledge. Mr. Halford of Lincoln's Inn will, when he arrives, present you with affidavits from Mr. Probert and from the rector confirming the existence and the contents of that document. He will also present you with the original, which Mr. Probert had the foresight, in the unsettled circumstances following my husband's death, to copy and to lodge with his own attorney in Cirencester, and which Mr. Halford collected from the attorney 3 days ago. Frederick had gone very white. "I do not know," he said, "what wild story Probert has been telling you, but Mr. Probert has been telling me the truth, Frederick. The rector, when he arrives, I have asked him to attend us at 3 o'clock, will tell you the same truth. Mr. Halford will tell you what your position now is. I shall tell you what I propose to do about it." I watched him. I did not enjoy it. I had thought I would. I had thought, in the long weeks of preparation in London, that there would be a particular satisfaction in seeing Frederick Ashworth, who had been so careful with his letters and so patient with his impediments and so smoothly determined to put me out of the country, understand at last that he had been outflanked. There was no satisfaction. There was only the tired, level recognition that a man who had taken something from me had to give it back, and that I was the person who had to make him do it. I had thought a great deal in those weeks about my husband, who had been the kindest man I had ever known, and who had loved me carefully, and who had drawn up a will in his own hand because he had wanted me, after he was gone, to be safe. Frederick had taken that will out of the cabinet. Frederick had stood at my husband's grave and watched the coffin lowered, and had gone home and taken the will out of the cabinet, and had said nothing for 13 months. I was not enjoying this, but I was also not stopping. "What I propose to do," I said, "is the following. You will, today, in front of Mr. Halford, sign an instrument acknowledging the validity of my husband's will and the assignment of the dower house to me. Mr. Halford has the document drawn up. You will sign it. You will not contest it. You will not, in the months and years to come, attempt to revisit the question through your own solicitors or through any application to the Court of Chancery, because Mr. Halford has prepared a brief in the alternative which sets out, in considerable detail, the grounds upon which a charge of concealment of testamentary documents might be brought against you, and which, if I am required to bring it, will be brought, and which will, in all probability, succeed. I do not wish to bring it. I wish you to sign the instrument, and to remain the Duke of Ashworth, and to keep your title and your seat and your estate unblemished, because my husband loved this house, and would not have wished me to take a hammer to the family name in pursuit of him. But the dower house is mine, Frederick, and I will have it." He sat down. He had not been intending to sit down. The chair was simply behind him, and his knees gave way. He sat in it, and he looked at me across the morning room of Thornfield Abbey, and he said, very quietly, "Frederica will not." "Frederica," I said, "is your problem, not mine. I do not propose to live in the same room with her. The dower house is 1/2 a mile from this house, and it has its own gates and its own approach, and I do not anticipate that our paths need cross more than 4 times a year. We may manage 4 times a year, you and Frederica and I. I have managed worse." There was a long silence. There was a knock at the door. Coombes opened it. "Mr. Halford of Lincoln's Inn, Your Grace," he said. I rose. So, after a moment, did Frederick. "Mr." Halford came in with his small leather case under his arm and his pale eyes taking in the room in a single glance that missed nothing. He bowed to me, he bowed to Frederick. He set the case on the table, and he opened it, and he laid out, in their proper order, the original will, the affidavit of Mr. Probert, the affidavit of the rector, who had not yet arrived, but whose document was already sworn, and the instrument of acknowledgment which Frederick was about to sign. He looked at Frederick. Frederick looked at me. I looked at the window, where the rooks were circling above the elms in the park I had come back to take. "Your Grace," said Mr. Halford very quietly to Frederick, "shall we begin?" Frederick signed. He signed because he had no other course. He signed because Mr. Halford's brief, though it had not yet been opened, was visible at the edge of the case, and he was a barrister, and he could read the title of it from where he sat, and he understood what it meant. He signed because the rector of Thornfield was, at that moment, walking up the avenue in his best black coat with his sworn affidavit in his pocket. He signed because his wife, Frederica, whom he had not consulted, would never forgive him if he was the Duke of Ashworth, who had been brought before the Court of Chancery on a charge of concealment. And he understood, even in the moment of signing, that the cost of the dower house was less than the cost of the scandal. He signed in 3 places. Mr. Halford countersigned. The rector arrived at 3 o'clock and added his witness, and Coombs, who had been watching from the doorway with the expression of a man at the theatre, was called in to witness the duplicate. Frederick and I shook hands at the end of it, because Mr. Halford was a man who understood the importance of forms. Frederick's hand was cold. Mine, I am told, was not. I did not move into the dower house that day. The dower house was not, in fact, ready. Frederick had not lied about the chimneys, only about the urgency of repairing them. I took up residence in the dower house 6 weeks later, in mid-May, and by that time the chimneys had been mended, the roof retiled, and the drawing-room repainted in a soft green that I had chosen myself. The house was a small one by the standards of Thornfield Abbey. It had 8 bedrooms and a long drawing-room with a south-facing bay and a library that had been, in the 3rd Duke's time, a music-room. It had a walled garden. It had its own gatehouse. It looked across half a mile of park toward the great south front of the abbey, and from my bedroom window I could see, in the morning light, the 2 stone lions on the steps and the carved Ashworth arms above the door, and I could remember that I had walked up those steps on the 1st of April with the smell of the limes still on my cloak, and that I had come home. It is 2 years now since that April. Frederick and Frederica have made Thornfield their seat, and they manage it adequately. And I am told Frederica has redecorated the long gallery in a style that would have given my husband considerable amusement. We meet, the 3 of us, at the 4 occasions a year I had foreseen. We are perfectly civil to one another. Frederick has not, since the morning-room, attempted any further encroachment, and I do not, in turn, attempt to manage his estate for him. We have arrived at the kind of arrangement 2 parties arrive at when one of them has been outmanoeuvred and both of them prefer, on reflection, not to discuss it. Mr. Probert died in the autumn of last year. I attended his funeral. I was the chief mourner, because he had no family, and I was glad to be. I have his diary on my desk which he left to me, and in which he had recorded, in his careful, elderly hand, the contents of every passage of every book in the Thornfield Library. And in the margin of one entry, against the 3rd Duke's diary, is a note in his hand that reads, "In this room, on a Tuesday in November of 1815, the master found a young woman reading on the floor." The consequences are recorded elsewhere. I have not yet decided what to do with that note. I think I shall do nothing. I write this in the library of the dower house, at a desk that was once my husband's, which I had brought across the park 6 weeks after I took possession. The light comes through the south-facing bay. There are roses in a low silver bowl on the table beside me, apothecary's roses, Rosa Gallica officinalis, which I cut myself from the south wall of the rose garden, where Mr. Probert and I had walked at a respectful distance behind a man who was pretending, very badly, to use a pair of pruning shears. I am 24. I am a widow. I am the owner, in fee simple, of the dower house at Thornfield Abbey. I came to this estate as a housemaid at 17, with 17 shillings in my reticule, and I leave it to no one, because a woman's freehold is her own. The rain that had been falling on the morning my husband died, and which had not, for me, entirely stopped in the 13 months that followed, ended, in any way that mattered, on the 1st of April in the morning room of Thornfield Abbey, when Frederick Ashworth set down his pen. It has not, since then, rained on me again.